Thank you to the Liberal Institute and the co-sponsors, students.
L'Association des étudiants de l'Université de Genève pour l'étude de la philosophie libérale.
And thank you all for coming tonight. I very much appreciated my first talk in Geneva, and I just came back from Paris, where I think I participated in the two first lectures and seminars on Ayn Rand ever in France. So that was a lot of fun and very satisfying to finally to bring Ayn Rand to Paris and to France. So as Pierre mentioned, Thomas Piketty's book on inequality or equality made a lot of waves in the United States, and not just in the United States, all over the world. Indeed, when Piketty travels these days, he travels first class, he charges hundreds of thousands of dollars per lecture, he gets treated to a red carpet everywhere he goes, he meets with presidents, all in the name of equality, right? Let's not forget that. Paul Krugman famously is given lectures on the evils of inequality, for which he charges $250,000 per lecture. These guys do not preach what they believe, which is probably good. I think that's probably the right thing. But what's interesting is that over the last 5-6 years, at least from an American perspective, it seems like every problem we encounter in the world has been blamed on inequality. Terrorism in the Middle East, well, that's the problem, obviously, is inequality. Slow growth in Western Europe and in the United States, well, that is obviously a problem caused by income or wealth inequality. The fact that poor people in the United States, and to some extent maybe in Europe as well, find it more difficult to be upwardly mobile, find it more difficult to break through into the middle class, into the upper classes. Well, the cause of that is inequality. The shrinking of the middle class, right? Again, caused by inequality, and cronyism at the top, all caused by inequality. Now, nobody actually has presented a theory of how this works. There is no theory out there that connects inequality to any of these phenomena. It is just stated, usually in the New York Times, and therefore it becomes truth that is repeated and repeated and repeated, and if you repeat something long enough, people start believing. But there is no, I challenge the economists in the room, there is no economic theory. Keynes did not say that economic growth is dependent on inequality or equality. There is some empirical studies that show that countries that have fast economic growth seem to be more equal, and countries with large inequalities seem to have struggles with economic growth. But these empirical studies tend to be absolutely worthless, because they lump together countries that have large inequalities like the United States and Zimbabwe in the same category. And yes, Zimbabwe will drag down, right, economic growth and every other parameter if you lump these countries together. And even when there is an empirical phenomena, again, there is no economic theory to suggest a relationship between any of these problems and the phenomena of inequality. And let's remember what inequality means. It means the gap, the difference between the poor and the rich in income or in wealth. So it's a number reflecting that difference. Sometimes reflected in something called the Gini coefficient, which is trying to give you an average of this gap. So we are told that there is this phenomenon called inequality, this gap, that is causing all these problems in the world. Now, the problems are real. There is a real problem of poverty, where the poor are not able to rise up. In America, it's become more and more and more difficult for poor people to enter the middle class. There certainly is a problem throughout the Western world of economic growth. Our economies are not growing anywhere near what we believe is their potential and what historically they have grown. And there certainly is a problem at the top. Some people are getting rich, not by producing, not by creating, not by building, but through cronyism. And maybe because of monetary policy. We can talk about that if you ask me about it. But none of those problems have anything to do with the gap. Indeed, the gap itself is not a problem. They are problems. And we can talk about why they exist and what the solutions are. But reducing inequality would not solve any of the problems we encounter. And countries that have reduced this inequality do not solve these problems. There's no empirical evidence. And there's no theoretical evidence that this fact works. It's a new ploy, in my view, by neo-Marxists, if you will, or by antagonists to capitalism and to freedom. It's a new ploy to try to convince us to engage in massive programs of redistribution. But there is no there. Indeed, to argue against inequality is to argue against human nature. We are unequal. We're different. If you look around the room, we're all different. We have different skills, different talents, different abilities, different motivations, different moral character. We're different. And as a consequence, when you take a bunch of different people and you set them free, you put them in an environment that has freedom, what do you get? The same results? That would be weird. That would be bizarre. When you have different people and you set them free, you get different results. Everybody is different. Everybody is going to create at different levels of interest. It's not just a matter of, remember, life, in spite of what the Marxists tell us, life is not about money. This coming from an Ayn Rand person, right? Life is not about money. Some of us choose to be teachers and advocates for ideas. We're pretty smart. We could have maybe gone to Wall Street and worked there and made a lot of money. But you know what? I'm willing to be middle class because what I do, I love. I do it because I love doing it. Because life is not about money. It's about love. It's about passion. It's about doing what you love doing. So this idea that money is everything, we should measure everything in terms of money, that the inequality in terms of the amount of wealth or the amount of income we have is what's important, is absurd. I have no problem with people making billions of dollars because they produce some great innovation that has made the world a better place. I couldn't do that. I mean, is there an inequality between those who do what they love to do and those who don't do what they love to do? Is that something we should, there are all kinds of things by which we can measure human life other than financial. So, inequality is the state of nature that man finds himself in when he is free. If you take away the burdens, if you take away regulations, if you take away taxes, if you leave us free to pursue our own lives, we will have different outcomes. Some of us are great programmers. Some of us have ideas that change the world. I hesitate to ask in this group, but why not? I mean, how do you become a billionaire? People always, these evil billionaires. How do you become a billionaire? This is important. This is the secret to success, right? Who knows, right? How do you become a billionaire? It's easy. Right? What does it take to become a billionaire? Work. So it's certainly, but we all work hard. I work hard. I'm not a billionaire, and I'm never going to be a billionaire, so it can't be just hard work. The janitor here in the building might work very hard, but he's not going to become a billionaire. So certainly working hard is a component, but that's not enough to make you a billionaire. What must you do in order to become a billionaire? You must have talent, but again, ballet dancers have talent, but they're not going to become billionaires. So you have to work hard, you have to have talent, but what's the secret sauce?
Produce something that everybody wants.
Yeah, it's easy. You have to have an idea, a new idea, because if everybody else has it already, it's too late. You have to have a new idea of how to produce something new, again, if it already exists, that everybody, or at least millions, if not billions of people want. And this is important, are willing to pay you for more than it costs you to produce. Easy, right? All of us should be billionaires. So you have to come up with something like this that nobody else thought of, or nobody else thought of doing quite as well. And then you have to be able to convince hundreds of millions of people to give up. Right now, Apple is trying to convince us to give up $1,000. That's the new iPhone X. Whatever the amount of money to buy one. And why would we do that? Why would we give up that money in order to buy one of these?
Make our lives happy.
Because our lives are going to be better if we do. Because they become more productive, happier, better. So the only way to become a billionaire is to make hundreds of millions of people better off. The only way to become a billionaire is to make hundreds of millions of people better off. When I see a billionaire, my first temptation is to go up and thank them. Because no matter what industry they're in, they probably have made my life better in some way. Now, if it's in technology, I know the guy who started Uber, the guy who started, if Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, I know how that impacted my life. But you cannot make $1 billion in a free market unless you provide a service, you provide a value to millions and millions and millions of people that make their lives better. So rather than resenting billionaires, we should be celebrating billionaires. We should be celebrating people who make a lot of money because they make our lives better. And that is something worthwhile. That is something to celebrate. Why is this so hard? Why is it so easy for people to get caught up in this idea of inequality as being bad? And I think there are a few kind of psychologically almost issues that the left or the inequality, those committed to the problems with inequality have convinced us as a culture of. So whenever you talk about inequality, people like to talk about the pie, right? There's a big pie. And it's a nice visual. It's a nice thing to look at, right? It's a pie. Everybody understands pies. We all got pizza. We all have to divide the pizza up. We know what a big slice is and what a little slice is. And people say, look, there's this big pie. And it's just not fair that some people get a big slice and other people get a small slice. And of course, if somebody gets a big slice, then how much is left for you? Less. The more they get, the less you have. What's wrong with the pie analogy? What's wrong with this?
It's funny.
It's static.
It's static. And it assumes zero sum, right? It assumes that if I have a big pie, you have a little one. But the fact is, as we just discussed with the billionaire example, is that the only way to become a billionaire is to grow the pie. Is while you are growing your pie, you're growing my pie as well. That's the beauty of markets. That's the beauty of trade. The beauty of trade is the only way to make your pie bigger is to make my pie bigger. I don't give up my money unless what I'm getting in return makes my life more than what it was before. My favorite example of this, I don't know, this is an older group. How many of you read Harry Potter? Harry Potter, is it in French? Okay, all the young people raised their hands, right? I read Harry Potter, right? I mean, this is a really terrible story. Because the story of Harry Potter is the story of the author, J.K. Rowling. That's what's interesting, right? And J.K. Rowling started out life as a welfare recipient. She was on welfare in England. And she wrote Harry Potter, and today she's a billionaire. I mean, that's terrible. because income inequality has grown significantly. And at my expense, because I don't know about you, now, a lot of the older people did not read Harry Potter, but not only did I read Harry Potter, but I have 2 sons, and each one of them read Harry Potter, and my sons were about Harry Potter's age. So every time a new book came out, I had to buy 2 copies. And then I had to buy an audio tape so I could listen. And then we had to go see the movie. I calculated that I spent anywhere between $2,000 to $3,000 on Harry Potter. 7 books. Do the math. 7 books, 7 movies. No, 8 movies, because they split one into 2, right? 8 movies. It's, you know, and everything else. I think there's a theme ride in Disneyland or something, so it never ends, right? I spent $2,000 to $3,000. I got poorer by $2,000 or $3,000. And J.K. Rowling became a billionaire. Talk about injustice. And inequality increased. I got poorer, she got richer. But that's weird. There's something wrong. What's wrong with that story?
You became richer as well.
I became richer as well, but can you measure that richness? Where does Piketty pick up that richness?
Are you happier?
I'm happier. I got spiritual pleasure from reading them. The books are really good. I really enjoyed them. They were fun. Now, when you do economics, when you do the math, when you do the numbers, where's the fun factor? All Piketty can see is I got $3,000 poorer. And the J.K. Rowling got $3,000 richer, and inequality grew. What Piketty and no economist can measure is the value I got in return for that $3,000. A value I chose to get in return. A value that is much more important to me than the money. But that's the nature of trade. That's the beauty of trade. That we are better off from that trade. But yet, you cannot measure it as an economist. And they don't measure any of that stuff. You buy a piece of art, might cost you a lot of money, and you put it on the wall, and you get spiritual pleasure. But according to Piketty, you just got poorer because you spent money on it. That is nuts. But that's typical Marxist. That's typical all about money, all about wealth. It has nothing to do with the spirit. It has nothing to do with pleasure. It has nothing to do with actually enjoying life. So they convince us there's a zero-sum game, but there isn't. There's a win-win, which is the nature of trade. Both parties win when it's voluntary trade. You know, unless you make a mistake, which happens. But generally, it's win-win. And they convince us that your gain is my loss. Not true again. Your gain is my gain. Win-win. So we've got this pie, but it's not static. It's growing. And every time your pie grows, my pie grows. Cool. But there's something even more insidious about this pie analogy. What's another problem with a pie? What do we assume when we say there's a pie? Well, we're assuming that wealth is social. There is an American pie, and there's a Swiss pie. There is no American pie. There is no American wealth. There is no collective wealth. All there is my pie, and your pie, and your pie, and your pie. We each bake our own pie. Our own pie is a product of our own effort, our own hard work, our own talent, our own ideas, our own skills. Our own pie is what we make of it. And yes, as economists, we can take all the pies and smush them all together and pretend there's such a thing called GDP, and pretend there's something called national wealth. But there isn't anything called national wealth. GDP doesn't exist. There's your wealth and your wealth and your wealth and your wealth. There's your income and your income and your income and your income. There's no aggregate income. That's just an abstraction that is useful economically, but is unuseful to discussing allocations of wealth. Because wealth is not allocated. Wealth is produced. And if you produce a big pie, how do I have a right to take your pie away from you? What right, because yours is big, do I have, because mine is small, to take some of yours for mine? The only way I can do that is by use of force. And why do I get the right to use force? Why do I get the right to steal, in other words? Because my pie happens to be, because I produced less, smaller than your pie. You produced it. It's yours. So the whole pie analogy is just wrong. And yet people use it all the time. And it is based on the assumption of collectivism. It is based on the assumption that individuals don't matter, which is, again, a typical leftist assumption. What matters are groups. What matters are collectives. As President Obama put it, you didn't build that. I don't know if you're familiar with that speech here in Switzerland that he gave, I think 3 or 4 years ago. It got a lot of press in the United States. But basically he came to a speech and said, look, you didn't build it. The government built the roads and the government created the infrastructure which you used in order to build it. You as a businessman, you didn't create the wealth that you have. You had a good teacher when you were in school. So she helped you. So the idea is to build something means you have to do it completely alone. You had employees. They helped you build it. Society. So in the end, you didn't build it. Society built it. And what advantage does that give them, right? If you didn't build it, it's not yours. And if it's not yours, then it's okay to take it from you. So this is part of, again, this trying to frame the debate in a way that allows them, to take our stuff away from us. You didn't build it. It's society's. It's not yours. And therefore we can take it in the name of society. But the fact is, you did build that. The Apple iPhone would not be in existence if not for Steve Jobs. And yes, he had lots of people who worked for him, lots of employees. And guess what? What happened to those employees? They all got paid. And given that Apple is a successful company, my guess is they got paid in proportion to how productive they were, in proportion to how much they contributed to making the iPhone and the rest of Apple's product. Otherwise, they would have left. Yes, there is infrastructure out there that the government has built. And where did it get the money to build all that infrastructure? What comes first? Government spending or business? Business. Because otherwise, where do they have the money to spend? They have to take it from somebody in order to spend. If you're in business, you've already paid for the infrastructure you use through your taxes. It's not that the infrastructure somehow appears. It's not like the poor pay for the infrastructure because they pay a tiny fraction of the taxes, at least in the US, which has the most progressive tax system in the Western world. It's the wealthy who pay for all those taxes, for all that infrastructure. And yes, a lot of us had a great teacher who helped shape us and make us better people. And justice would say that if you made it, became very successful, and you think that teacher played a role in it, then you should go back to the school, write a nice check, and say thank you to her. But the fact that you had a great teacher does not diminish the fact that you took what she taught you and did something with it. You did that. People talk about what shapes human being, and there's a big discussion in psychology between those who believe it's nature and those who believe it's nurture, right? So is it your genes or is it your environment? What shapes you? And then there are the radicals who think it's some combination of both. And I say they're all wrong. What shapes you? You do. You have choices. You have free will. I still believe in free will. I know it's not a very popular view these days. You make who you are. Yes, your genes matter, sure. Yes, the environment in which you're raised matters. It influences you, no question. But at the end of the day, it's what you do with those genes. It's what you do with that environment, with those opportunities you were granted. You are responsible for who you are, and therefore you are responsible for the wealth that you create. So none of these myths are true. None of these stories that Piketty and the rest of them tell are real. Inequality is a feature of freedom. Equality of outcome is impossible. And you should always be suspicious of anything that is impossible. You can't make us equal. We're different. There's only one way to attempt to make us equal. How's that? Well, when we're dead, we're all equal. That's true. That's the only time we're all equal at the end. But you know, there's a pretty horrific story, true story, unfortunately, of some intellectuals who tried to make everybody equal, tried to create a society in which everybody was equal. And they studied, of course, in Paris. That's where you get these kind of ideas from, right? And they went back. They went back to their country. They went back to their native country, and they actually achieved political power. And they said, okay, we're going to take these ideas that we learned from Sartre and Foucault and all these other guys, and we're going to implement them, and we're going to establish the first truly egalitarian country in the world. And they noticed that people lived in these cities and people lived in the countryside. So what do? Right? They're unequal in the cities and in the countryside. So how do you resolve that problem? Well, you empty the cities. You drive everybody out into the countryside. But even then, people in the countryside are, some of them are educated, some of them are not, some of them can read, some of them can't, some of them are good farmers, some of them are not so good farmers, some of them are good foragers. They pick fruits and nuts and berries well, and others are not. So what do? Well, there's only one thing you can do. You shoot anybody who's better than anybody else. If you wore glasses, you were shot. If they thought you had a college or high school degree, you were shot. If you exhibited any characteristics of being better in any dimension, in any way than other people, you were shot. Literally killed. And these are the killing fields of Cambodia. This is what the Khmer Rouge did. This is what Pol Pot and his friends did. And to this day, people in the Khmer Rouge serve in the government in Cambodia. They have never paid the price for the crimes, for the horrific, horrific crimes that they committed. Noam Chomsky, for decades, was an apologist for the Khmer Rouge. Why? Because their goal was good. They wanted equality. But equality means death. There's only one form of equality that means anything tangible, that means anything real, that means anything of value. And that is political equality. That is equality of rights, equality of liberty, equality before the law, where the law is there to protect rights. Is the equality of the right to your own life. In other words, equality of freedom. We're all born free. It doesn't matter what your color of your skin, your sex, or your family name is. You are supposed to be free under the law. A proper state leaves you free to exercise your skills and your abilities to the best of your ability. You are all equal in the right to pursue happiness and to take the actions that we believe are necessary in order to flourish as human beings, in order to be successful in our lives. That is the only freedom that is meaningful. That's what the Founding Fathers of America meant when they say in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. We're created equal in our freedom, in our rights. Note that any attempt to make us more equal in outcome, in income, in wealth, is a violation of our equality of rights. We tax some people, steal their money, and give it to other people. That's not equal before the law. That's not equal in rights. Some people have more rights than others. We have to break somebody's legs in order to make us equal. There's no other way to do it. Equality of outcome necessitates violence, always, everywhere. And violence is wrong, whether we call it taxes or whether we take it to the extreme of the Khmer Rouge. It is wrong. So we should be advocates of equality, proper equality, equality of freedom. And when we're all equally free, we're going to be unequal in outcome. That's life. That's metaphysical reality. And I think it's great. I think it's wonderful that people are unequal in outcome if it's an outcome of their political equality. Thank you. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I'll take questions. Discussion. Don't be shy. Yeah.
How good is the Gini factor in terms of measuring inequality?
It's very poor. I mean, even Piketty, when he uses it, says it's got flaws. It doesn't really capture what we're trying to capture. So most economists don't believe the Gini factor is very good at capturing, at really capturing inequality. And again, what does the Gini factor mean in Zimbabwe? And what does it mean in the United States? And what did it mean in the 19th century versus what does it mean today? Because suddenly, in Zimbabwe, what it's capturing is the ability of the dictator to steal money, right? In the United States, it's still capturing the ability of some people to produce. That's a completely different thing. It's not telling you anything interesting about what's going on in that country. That's why you cannot lump countries based on their inequality. The real question is why? Is it freedom that generated it? Or is it theft that generated it?
What is your view on gender equality or inequality?
Well, again, what is my view on gender equality or inequality? I mean, again, my view is that politically, gender should be equal, right? I mean, so in terms of rights, all genders, today I hear there are 52 different genders. I always thought there were two. That all genders are equal before the law. All genders have the right to freedom. In terms of economic equality, I leave that to the market. I think it's a market question, and I think a free market handles it, if there is a difference, and I think there has been. Women have been discriminated against in the workplace. There's no question about that. There's been a glass ceiling for women. But I think the more we encourage economic freedom, the more likely that those things go away. And I'll give you one example. I speak a lot at law schools, and they always complain that female lawyers make less money than male lawyers for the same jobs. And I said, then if that's the case, if that were true, then I've got a great business opportunity for you. You should start an all-female law firm. And you should pay the lawyers more than what these discriminatory law firms are paying them, right? Because supposedly they're being underpaid. And a little less than what they pay the men, right? So you improve their conditions so they're better off. And you will rake it in because you'll get higher quality lawyers for less, right? Because they're the same as the men and yet you're paying less. So, we should all be creating all-female law firms. And the fact that those don't exist suggests to me that there probably isn't a pay gap.
Well, not necessarily, because maybe the clients don't value the work of a female lawyer as much as a male lawyer.
So we can extrapolate here the irrationality of the world many times over, but certainly not all clients. Most clients would like to win and would like to pay less on their bill. So certainly not all clients would hire you, but certainly enough clients would hire your firm to make that firm viable. And over time, as other clients, markets work. Markets work. So the best way to solve problems of unequal pay is to let the market work. And legislation is the worst way to do it. It's just like affirmative action. Now I have to pay a female lawyer and a male lawyer the same, whether they're equal in ability or not. Because the law you can't pass a law that says, if you find a male lawyer and you find a female lawyer and they're exactly the same in terms of the quality, then you should pay them the same. Because the law, the quality is, how do you tell? What's the objective factors that determine quality? Exam, test results, that wouldn't work. So then you're forced to pay people the same, even if they're not the same quality. and now people start resenting each other. It's the same effect affirmative action has in the United States, right? You start bringing in more minorities into law schools, whether they're qualified or not, because you're forced to, because you've got a quota that you have to meet. And now the person being accepted into law school is not sure whether they were accepted because they're good or whether they're accepted because of the color of their skin. And the people who are with them in the law school are saying, is he good or was he accepted? You know, so you create a lot of resentment. And I think over time you create more racism, not less. And I think what you're seeing today in America with the increase in racism and the increase in polarity is a consequence of 40 years of affirmative action, 40 years of reverse racism, and people resenting that, and it built up anger and built up frustration over it. You let the market work. What you need to get rid of, and this is what the civil rights movement was so good and important at, what you need to get rid of is laws that discriminate. Laws don't treat people the same. Laws that don't treat people with equal rights. And the civil rights movement had ended with that, then I think we would live today in America in a much healthier racial climate.
Well, there was a scholar in Lausanne in the 19th century named Pareto who discovered the
Pareto optimal solutions, yes.
Pareto distribution.
Yes.
And basically, he studied income differences, and that's how we came to this distribution.
Yeah.
And this is pretty much something that is inescapable because it reproduces each time and everywhere. So are the Marxists trying to beat the mathematics?
Yes, I mean, Marxism is an anti-nature, anti-reality system of thought. Marx is fighting against reality. He's fighting against Aristotle's laws of logic. He's fighting against the metaphysical nature of human beings as individuals. He's fighting against the world. This is why Marxism has to, not when it's practiced poorly, but has to lead to violence. And every single time it's practiced, socialism everywhere and always leads to violence. Because it's built in, because it's anti-nature. So if I confront something and I want you to be something you cannot be, I have to kill you, or I have to try to force you to be that thing, because you're not going to be it. So Marxism is anti-human nature, and therefore must always lead to violence. And this all comes from philosophy. I mean, Hegel taught that contradictions are wonderful, and that life was full of contradictions. Well, I mean, if that's the case, then we're doomed. But luckily it's not the case. Reality is such that contradictions don't exist, and Aristotle's laws of logic actually do hold, and they are valid. And the law of identity and the law of causality is real, and they apply to nature, and they apply to economics, and they apply to the nature of man just as much as they apply to anything else. And the only economic political system that is consistent with human nature, and therefore does not require violence, is capitalism, is freedom. All capitalism is freedom. Capitalism is a system that leaves us free and protects us. Yeah.
So what is human nature?
I mean, Aristotle defined man as the rational being, and I believe that's what human nature is. I think we haven't fully embraced our nature. We have free will, so we can reject our nature. We're a unique species in that a cheetah, an elephant, cannot reject their nature. They are what they are. They're programmed, that's it. We as human beings can actually reject our nature. We can say, we're not going to think. Now, the consequences are pretty awful when we do that. Death and destruction. So as a civilization, we need to learn this. And indeed, I believe that the peaks of civilization happen when we recognize that our fundamental nature is as reasoning beings. And I would say the two peaks of civilization were the Greeks and the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, of course, is the age of reason. It's the recognition of the efficacy of reason. It's the efficacy of rational human thought, of individual rational human thought. Because only individuals can think. Groups can't think any more than groups can eat. Nobody can eat for me, and nobody can think for me. So it's as we mature as human beings, as we mature culturally, I think the most important idea that we must learn is that our nature is to think, our nature is to reason, and when we don't, and if we don't, the consequences are catastrophic.
I would like to take the opportunity and to reason a little bit about when you said that the only way to become a billionaire is to produce for profits.
Yes, in a free market.
Okay.
I just took away.
So you reduce,
Sure.
nearly to utopia something that has a historically completely different face.
Yes.
I mean, you think about the peaks of civilization, talking about antique Greece and
Yeah.
about the
Yeah.
Siècle des Lumières and so on. But what is all in between? My rationality tells me that I am stronger than the other one.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
I should profit from that. Even today, I mean, being rich, you have always a choice. Joining the mafia or produce.
Yes.
Rob or produce. This is human nature too, isn't it?
I don't think that's human nature. I think that's corruption of human nature, and people are tempted by that corruption, but that doesn't make it human nature. I think when we talk about human nature, one looks at what is that which is required to live successfully as a human being. And I think and I think stealing is not living successfully as a human being. We can have a whole discussion about stealing, lying, but I'm talking about not just materially. I'm talking about as a human being, as the full spiritual experience as being human. And I think if you lie, steal, and cheat, you're not living that life. You're living a different life. And I know just from my personal experience, when I lie, how bad that is and the awful consequences that I get. And when you steal, you basically recognize your own impotence in producing. Stealing is a form of self-recognition that I'm not capable of taking care of myself. I need somebody else to produce, because somebody has to produce. And then I steal from them. So you tend to find that people who steal are not happy, are not successful as human beings. But let me get to the question. Yes, it is true that there are vast periods in human history where people got rich by stealing. Indeed, most of human history. Right? It's only in the last 200 years that we have had freedom, where wealth is a product of production. Indeed, before the Enlightenment, before the end of the Enlightenment, if you will, before the Industrial Revolution, the world was a zero-sum game pretty much. You look, I don't know if you've ever seen this graph, it's a pretty well-known graph, of wealth or income per capita in human history, right? 10,000 years ago. Maybe the young people haven't seen this, right? 10,000 years ago, income was about just under $3 a day. 10,000 years ago, in today's dollars. Imagine living on $3 a day. And then it stayed at about $3 a day. And it stayed at $3 a day. And it stayed there for a very, very long time, like for 10,000 years. And then, miraculously, it went like that. So this is the only period that counts. I agree. Everything before that was looting and stealing, and that's all we knew. It's really, that was life. And I understand that Europeans still, because it's hard to catch up, you should catch up, still think in wealth in terms of aristocrats. And what makes an aristocrat? What made an aristocrat? Your ability to steal, your ability to exploit, your ability to capture a zero-sum pie, a bigger piece of it. Right? So Europeans still think of wealth in terms of aristocrats of old. The difference is America, because America is a nation of the Enlightenment, it's the nation of the Industrial Revolution, the starting point was when wealth started to be created, where the pie started getting bigger, where the only way to become a billionaire, like Carnegie or Mellon or Rockefeller or any of these guys, was to create value, was to win-win relationships. That was the way to make money. So in America, it's much more instilled, ingrained in our psyche, the idea of wealth creation, the idea of admiring wealth producers, because we don't have that history of aristocracy, of stealing. Now, it's true. There are people even today that steal and become billionaires. But that's not what Piketty's talking about. If Piketty said, look, there's a real problem in the world today. Putin has stolen $10 billion or whatever the number is, and he's got it all in a Swiss bank account, and that's wrong. Or there's too much in America cronyism. These bankers, they go grovel in front of Washington, and they get all these favors, and they get bailouts, and they get a lot of money, and that's wrong. I wish I wouldn't be on his side if that were the case, right? But that's not what he's arguing against. He's upset at Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. So, yes, we can divide the world up today, those who have produced billions and those who have stolen billions. And if our problem is with those who have stolen billions, I'm with you. But the problem is not inequality. The problem is they stole the billions. And the problem is even bigger. The problem is we allowed them to steal the billions. We've encouraged them to steal the billions. We vote for them to steal more billions. We love the European Central Bank. We love the Federal Reserve, who are basically stealing billions and reallocating wealth in all kinds of weird ways. We don't oppose that. We all support the distortion of wealth distribution democratically, and so that's why it's so hard, because we're all in it. But if that were the complaint, if that was what Piketty was, or Stiglitz or Krugman were actually complaining about, then I'd be on their side. But that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about inequality that is a consequence of the market. And therefore, what do they want? They want to regulate the market even more. So that, what happens when you regulate the market even more? Even more wealth gets stolen. I mean, this is the thing. If you care about cronyism, what is the solution? What's the solution to cronyism?
More
Proper institutions.
Less power to government.
Proper institutions, yes, but which ones?
Make sure that the system remains.
Competition is not the solution to cronyism. There was no, Rockefeller had 92% of all the overfunding capacity in the U.S. in the 1870s, had very little competition, and yet he was not a crony. What is the
Fair playing field.
What's that?
The government.
Government. The bigger the government, the more the cronyism. If you're going to regulate me, guess what? I'm going to try to bribe you. And if I don't bribe you explicitly, I'm going to bribe you in some other way. But I'm going to want to be involved in how you regulate me. The only solution to cronyism is to shrink government. The smaller the government, the less cronyism there is. The smaller the government, the less corruption is. Because there's a famous story. It's a true story. In the early 1990s, Microsoft, at the time, was the largest company in the world. Most innovative, most productive, and made the most money. And by market cap, largest. And how much money did they spend on lobbying Washington, D.C.? Exactly zero. No lobbying. They did not want to have anything to do. No presence, no lawyers, no building, no lobbyists, nothing in D.C. So they were brought in front of Congress. And the executives of Microsoft sat, and Orrin Hatch, a Republican senator from Utah, still in the Senate to this day, yelled at them, "You guys have to start having a presence in Washington. You need to build a building here. You need to hire lawyers. You have to lobby. In other words, bribe me, please." And Microsoft, at the end of the hearing, literally the guy said, "We're not interested. You leave us alone, we'll leave you alone." And they walked out. 6 months later, knock at the door. We're from the Justice Department. And we're here because you violated antitrust laws. What did they do? Anybody remember what Microsoft's sin was? They were offering a product for free. Oh my God. Because some of us remember that we paid $75 for Netscape. Remember paying $70 to get a web browser? Yeah. And then what Microsoft did is they bundled Internet Explorer with Windows so you could get it for free. That was the violation of antitrust laws that the Justice Department spent 10 years prosecuting them. And then another 10 years of a government official sitting at Microsoft headquarters signing off on any decision they made over bundling. Everything's bundled today. I mean, look at this. This is one big bundle that Apple makes a fortune off of. Microsoft invented bundling. Good for them. But they got nailed for it. Now, why did they really get nailed? Because they spent $0 on lobbying. How much do they spend today? Tens of millions. They've got a beautiful building, glass, many stories high, right about equal distance from the White House and from Congress, called the Microsoft Building in Washington, D.C. And they're cronies, because you have to be a crony, because the government demands that you be a crony.
So that's just proof that the institutions are not correct, because essentially corruption is legal in the US.
Yeah, corruption's legal everywhere.
That's
You know, you just find more subtle ways to be corrupt. But if I'm going to be in your business, you're going to want to be in mine. That's just survival. If you're going to regulate me, if I'm a banker and you're going to regulate me, I want to have a say in how those regulations are written, and I'm going to find a way, whether it's corruption or whether it's something else, to influence that decision. And I bet you that happens in Switzerland all the time. And I bet you it happens in every country. It's not an issue. It is an issue of institutions. It's an issue of institution called government that has way too much power. And if we shrink that power, then the cronyism goes away. So it's the exact opposite solution of what Krugman and Stiglitz and Piketty want. They want to grow the institution, which will only increase cronyism. I mean, I never use the word crony capitalism, because in the capitalism there is no cronyism. It's crony statism. All statism is crony. In all statism, businessmen have influence and try to exert influence, because otherwise they die. So you do it out of sheer survival. You have no choice.
How would you devise your own tax system? Because even with flat rates, the rich pay more than others, so you can argue that that's not fair.
Well, I mean, if I had an ideal system, it would be very close to zero, so it wouldn't matter that much. You could shrink U.S. government spending by 80%, and so once you shrink, see, to me, taxes are less important than spending, because spending are either you're taxing now or taxing in the future, and I consider government bonds. The economic effect of government bonds is the same as it's very similar effect to taxes, because it's basically sucking money out of the private economy from productive activity and into consumption by the government, which is non-productive. It's destructive. So my focus is always on spending. I want to shrink government spending by between 80 to 90%, so that government does only what it's supposed to do, which is military, defense, and judiciary. And if you get to that point, then we can talk about taxes. Taxes become easy at that point because there's so little revenue to then consumption tax would be the simplest, and ultimately, I mean, I know this sounds nuts, but ideally you find a way to make a coercive taxation be zero.
How would you?
Well, you charge for certain services the government provides, for example, for arbitration, like legal stuff, and you take voluntary contributions of people. And I know in Europe everybody looks at me like I'm completely nuts because you guys don't do stuff voluntarily. But if you look at a free country, it's not that science fiction to imagine that. And so I don't believe in compulsion and coercion, but I do believe in government. I'm not an anarchist.
Well, philanthropy.
Yeah, philanthropy is a great example of that. Yeah. I believe in a safety net that's private.
How to decide if it's science fiction or not? I think the best way to look at it is history, isn't it?
Well, history suggests that people are incredibly generous in free societies, that without a government safety net, things function fantastically well, that when the U.S. government spent no more than 3.5% of GDP during the 19th century, other than the Civil War, the economy grew at historically the fastest rates in human history. History suggests that capitalism and freedom work. History suggests that socialism fails, and yet nobody wants to learn from history and nobody cares about history. Because it's not about history, it's about...
I don't think that the lessons of history are so clear-cut as you think. I believe that it depends what level you want of government services, for instance. If you want, for instance, say, health insurance or without jobs or such things like that.
Those are not government services. Those are government destructions. There is no government service providing health insurance. What there is the government destroying your ability to get good health care. There is no such thing as government services that provide education, what it's doing is destroying the opportunity to have a robust system of education. Government does not provide, government cannot create, government doesn't build, government can only destroy when it comes to things that are not, government is a gun. You can only use a gun to shoot things. Guns don't build. Guns don't build. So when I look at government schools, I see destruction. I see terrible performance. I see lost opportunities. I see, I imagine, and it's not hard to imagine, I imagine entrepreneurs trying to make money, producing a great educational program. I see entrepreneurs, instead of creating the next Angry Bird stupid app for this thing, going into education and figuring out how to create apps that raise our educational levels because they can make money producing schooling at a very cheap level for people all around the world. When I see government schools, I see the crowding out of capital, the disappearance of private capital entering a field. When I see government-provided health insurance, it's not insurance, it's redistribution of wealth, then I see the destruction of medical innovation. I see the destruction of doctors' lives so that they now are salaried employees of the government instead of entrepreneurs, which is what they should be, who are pushing the envelopes of healthcare, which is what our lives depend on. And it's not insurance, because it's one product that we all get that is not based on risk, that is not based on any characteristic that have to do with insurance. So let's stop calling it insurance. It's a government granting of a certain a certain benefit, entitlement. Call it entitlement because that's more fitting. It's a form of welfare. So these are not government services. These are forms in which government is destroying pieces of our lives. And government is only good at one thing, and that is protection. It's a massive protection agency, and that's what it should stick to. It's good at arbitrating disputes because, and it's good at that primarily because it is the final authority, because it has the final gun. But that's it. Anything else government touches, look at traffic in Geneva. These are government roads. You think a private enterprise that provided this kind of service would survive? No. Now, do I know how to privatize the roads in Geneva? No. But I bet you there's an entrepreneur out there who can figure it out and actually create competition around it and build a tunnel under the lake or whatever the issues are. But government cannot do these things, and when it does it, it messes them up. It has to mess them up. There's no other choice.
I think that is a caricature. That is not exactly what we observe. You take some bits that are negative of government service, if you permit, just to have a turn. I mean,
Sure.
It is not by looking at what works badly at any institution, even at private institutions, that defines the whole thing.
No,
You're taking the bad things to try to define the whole thing.
I'm saying,
there are excellent,
but I'm not doing that.
excellent state schools. There are excellent state hospitals. There are bad.
How do you know they're excellent?
We don't agree.
We don't agree.
We don't agree at all.
But how do you know they're excellent when you don't have a market to compare them to? I mean, the thing about education, this is why it's so sad about education. Yeah, they're really good public schools in America. Compared to what? Because if we had a robust competitive market in education, education could be, in my view, 100 times better than the best public schools are today. And we don't know that because we missed opportunity. But in every area, and this is not just empirical, this is theoretical, and it's fundamentally a rights-based approach. The idea is that government has no right to enter these fields. It has no right to be in healthcare. By being in healthcare, it is using force against individual citizens, and it is violating their rights. So, but economic theory would suggest that schools would be 1,000,000 times better if there was private sector, and that's true. That's true of healthcare. It's true of every field. And indeed, when we have empirical observations to evaluate, we see it. Now, I ask audiences, what would this look like? What would this look like if the government built it? Everybody laughs. Every audience laughs. This is simple. This is a simple product as compared to education. If government can make this, a simple little product like this, if we imagine how ugly it would be and how inefficient and how big it would be, then why do we give the brains of our kids to the government? That's a far more important and far more sophisticated thing, that the last people in the world to deal with it should be government bureaucrats or healthcare. If they can't make this, you want them making life or death decisions about what kind of treatment you should get when you have a heart attack? No, keep the government away from me. So I want the government, on theoretical grounds, on empirical grounds, to do only that which they are qualified to do, which is a gun. And I think the empirics clearly showed that this is true, everywhere in any place that it is tried.
We had a Swiss phone, a Swiss government phone that was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It was big, black. 1 minute to the US costed about 10 francs.
I mean, I remember AT&T in the United States, a government protected monopoly that finally was broken up as a monopoly, but it was a government monopoly, it wasn't a market monopoly, and it was a disaster. I mean, how many examples do we need? How many examples do we need? You know, you've got the electricity grid in the United States, which is basically national, and it's a disaster. It's bad. It runs badly. If it was privatized, we know it would be better. I mean, nobody has any doubt about that.
But you would have the robber barons.
What's that?
You would have the robber barons. You would have
Yes.
those who are fought by
Yes,
part
you have
of the society.
inequality. You know, you take the great geniuses of the 19th century, the people who built America, the people who created everything that we have today in America, and what do? You call them robber barons. As if they're the barons from here in Europe who robbed people on the highways, right? That's how they created their wealth. No, these are the people who made America. They built their wealth in America. They were giants. They were the heroes. They should be celebrated. Their statue should be up there, not General Lee, not this general or that general, not this president or that president. We should have statues of businessmen in our boulevards. They're the people who build the world. They're the wealth creators. They make our lives what they are. Not bureaucrats, not presidents. Who cares who the president is? I mean, we do today because they have so much power over life. But in a real free world, who our politicians are would not be that big of an issue, because they would have very little power over our lives. Yeah.
So how do we get
Before
that?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Before we part,
Yes.
I was expecting in coming here, I know very little about Ayn Rand.
Yeah.
And you spoke very little about
Yes.
Ayn Rand. So my question is, how much of your talk is directly related to what Ayn Rand philosophy was? I have no clue.
Yeah. So I'd say, I hope, if I did the talk well, that everything. Ayn Rand was the great advocate for wealth creation, for production, for individual rights, for the right of the producer to keep what he produces. She was a strong advocate of limited government limited to the protection of individual rights, and otherwise no redistribution of wealth, no government services, no government property. So everything I've said, both in the Q&A and in the talk, would be consistent with what Ayn Rand wrote. Again, I hope. I mean, she might be mad at me right now, but who knows? But her philosophy is a philosophy based on the idea in politics of individual rights, of the right of every individual to act for the purpose of his own happiness and his own flourishing, in the pursuit of his own rational values that he needs in order to survive and in order to thrive, and that other individuals have no right to use force against him in order to achieve their goals. So I live for myself in pursuit of my values, you live for yourself. As long as I don't violate your rights, the state has no business in what I do with my life. And if that produces vast inequality, who cares? Would be her response. So you know, we can do a different talk on Ayn Rand's philosophy, but this is an extension of Ayn Rand's philosophy.
One point which is of interest to me is, as you had a clear plea in favor of government as the major gun
Yes.
to make people safer.
Yes.
Is there any hint in Ayn Rand philosophy
Yes.
that leads you to say that?
Oh yeah, everything. Her entire philosophy leads me to say that. So, and she wrote about it. So I encourage you to read. She's got 2 essays at the end of The Virtue of Selfishness and the End of Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, called Man's Rights, and then the second essay is called The Nature of Government. And she's very explicit about the nature of government. She believes in a government. She believes that government is a necessary good. And she writes extensively about this. So this is not me hypothesizing about what maybe she said. This is what she wrote. And you can find that in, again, the essay called The Nature of Government that follows man's rights, and they combine the two. She was horrified by the idea of anarchy, of a lack of government. She talked about that, and so the Q&As that she did when she was asked about libertarianism and about anarcho-capitalism, and she viewed anarcho-capitalism as a contradiction in terms, that you couldn't be a capitalist if you were an anarchist, that capitalism required government and necessitated government, and the government was a necessary good. And so this is not speculation, this is what she wrote and what she said.
No, but as you said nothing about it, I'm happy to listen to that. What?
Oh, well, that wasn't the topic. That wasn't my topic. That wasn't my topic. I wasn't giving a talk about the difference between objectivism and
My question
anarchism.
was to link what you said with Ayn Rand philosophy.
Everything I said was a direct derivative from Ayn Rand's philosophy.
It's better to be explicit, isn't it?
Oh, it depends, right? It depends. It doesn't always. You had a...
Oh, I was just wondering how we get there. Because,
Well, I mean,
if you look at the state of the world, there's a lot of, I would say it's not even cronyism, it's just simple lobbying all the time.
Yes.
Everywhere. And so democracy has become,
Well, democracy has become
is no longer fit for government.
It's gang warfare. What we have today is we have interest groups that constantly push. So in a sense, there is a zero-sum world out there where your special interest is trying to get more stuff at my expense, and a lot of, I think, the resentment that exists in society is because we have a feeling that this is rigged in this way. How do we get there? I don't think there are any shortcuts. I think the only way to get there is education, education, education. I think the only way to get there is to educate young people about the virtues of freedom, to educate young people about the virtues of liberty, and then they need to demand to be free. But there's no shortcut. There's no silver bullet. There's no something we do that will change the world. I wish there was. I mean, if somebody knows of a silver bullet, let me know. I'd love to be able to do it. But people have to want to be free. To be free. I don't believe people want to be free. And the welfare state encourages people not to want to be free. It encourages them to stay dependent. And that's sad and tragic, and we need to educate people about how sad and tragic it is, and that they should not want to be part of the welfare state. But that's, again, education, education, education.
Speaking about education, but what do you think about the fact that the United States government is spending more in the prison system than in public education?
Well, I'm glad they're not spending it in public education, because that's wasted money, and it only does more to corrupt the kids. So there's no correlation in the United States between states that spend a lot of money per child and states that spend a little bit of money per child. There's no correlation in terms of quality. The only benefit of spending a lot of money on public education is the teachers. Teachers' unions get more money. It is horrible what's going on in prisons in the United States. We have many crimes that are victimless crimes. We send way too many people to jail. Millions of people to jail that shouldn't be in jail. One of the biggest tragedies in the world today is the war on drugs, as if you can have a war against an inanimate object. It's a war that's failing, has to fail, cannot be successful, and as a consequence of the war on drugs, well over 1 million people are sitting in American jails for victimless crime, for possessing a substance that might cause them damage, but who cares? It's causing them damage. And if they sell it to other people, but that's their problem. It's not, why is it my problem? And certainly, why is it the state's problem? So yes, I think what's happening in American prisons is tragic. I also think that criminals, real criminals, murderers, rapists, thieves, get treated way too nicely in prison. So too much money is spent making their lives pleasant in prison. I mean, if you kill somebody, water and bread, right? I mean, I have no sympathy for people who are violent against other people. No sympathy. Rapists, throw away the keys. What was that? I mean, the very idea should be so abhorrent that why anybody would ever be let out of jail once you commit such a violent crime, I don't understand. So I think, yes, we coddle prisoners too much and spend too much money on them by coddling them. We have too many people in jail, and we should be cutting back on the number of people in jail, which will reduce the budget significantly. But the solution is not to spend that money on public education. The solution is, the only way we're ever going to educate young people is to privatize the educational system. And I would auction off all the schools, sell them, all of them. And I think it's the number one most important issue in the world, is to get rid of state, I don't call it public education, I call it government education. There's state education. This is the state getting involved in the ideas your children are learning, and it's none of their business. You should be, as parents, deciding what your kids get an education in. And by the way, Ayn Rand said all that as well.
Very well. Well, I think we.
Thank you.